Good morning, everyone. I think we're ready to go. My name is Owen Jenkins, and I'm Research Director here at CIRIA. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar, the Global Resource Demand on Marine Sand and Gravel. So the program, if you can, next slide. We have a good program for you today with presentations from Cees, Laban, Arnaud, Vander, Velpen, and Andrew Bellamy. This event's been developed by the European Marine Sand and Gravel Group, EMSAGG, which CIRIA has been secretariat to for over 20 years, and Cees Laban has been chair for a number of years. So to introduce Cees is a marine geologist and has worked in many parts of the world. He also very recently received the Van der Graaf Medal awarded by the Royal Dutch Geological Mining Society, the highest honour that can be awarded in the Netherlands to earth scientists. So Cees is going to give an introduction to EMSAGG. So over to you, Cees.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, dear audience. With a few sheets. Oh, my sheet is not the sheet. Can I have the next sheet? Yeah, and next sheet, please. Yeah. So again, good morning, dear audience. With a few sheets, I will inform you about EMSAGG. The European Marine Sand and Gravel Group was 22 years ago established by professionals as an independent body drawing together stakeholders from across the industry, governmental, environmental, academic, and research organizations. What is EMSAGG doing? We are identifying developments and information needs for the marine sand and gravel stakeholders about all aspects of the marine sector and enabling exchange and information, experience of ongoing research, licensing, execution and monitoring relating to the marine sand and gravel resources. What are our activities? We are facilitating events to discuss developments and information needs concerning marine sand and gravel. This includes every 3 years an international conference and yearly a learning seminar in a different European country. The next conference was planned in 2021, but is extended to 2022. So in the 22 years, we have been twice to Ireland for a seminar, twice to the UK, twice in Denmark, twice in Germany, 3 times in the Netherlands, twice in Belgium, twice in France, in Portugal, in Italy, and twice in Turkey. Conferences have been held in London, in the UK, in Cork, in Ireland, twice in the Netherlands, in Delft, once in Belgium in Ostend, and in Italy in Rome. Besides the seminars and the conferences, the EMSAGG members meet formally twice a year in a different partners country to discuss the innovation and developments within the sector. An annual bulletin is produced, including articles highlighting the work of interest and the latest information from across the industry, and is circulated to around 3,500 contacts. We have a website including downloadable bulletins, conference presentations, papers, details of our members, projects and proposals, and also useful links to the industry and stakeholders. What are the benefits, in fact, to be involved in the EMSAGG? By networking and developing contacts throughout the marine aggregate and related industries, linking with suppliers, regulators, and leading research organizations. You will become a part of a forum for a rapid exchange of information relevant to the marine aggregates and improving access to current research, best practice, and case studies. And you're raising your profile of your organization and its role in an international forum. And finally, the opportunities to guide and participate in future international research and cross-industry initiatives. For more information, please visit our website, ciria.org EMSAGG. And I thank you for your attention, and I wish you a very pleasant webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cees. Our next speaker is Arnaud Vander Velpen, who is the sand and aggregates expert at the United Nations Environment Programme. So over to you, Arnaud.
Thank you. I hope everyone hears me well. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, for handing me the floor. So today I will present to you the Global Sand Observatory Initiative. But before we dive into this topic, I will provide you a broader background. So when we talk about sand, we usually think about beaches, holiday destinations, but our relationship to sand looks more like this. Our relationship to sand is more as a component of materials like concrete, asphalt, building materials with which we make our infrastructure, our roads, our houses and building blocks, and which also help us to create infrastructure such as hydropower dams, who, if not created with sediment bypass, also stop a lot of sediment moving to the sea. Moreover, we use sand even for glass. We use it for land reclamation, as you can see here for Singapore. Singapore increased between 1973 and 2018 with up to 23%. And this has been largely done with sand. We even use it for our electronics. Sorry, that went a little bit too fast. But what we need to know about sand is that sand has been created over long geological time periods. It takes thousands of years, and it is the result of slow erosion and varied processes such as rivers, the ocean, the working of the ocean on the coast, glaciers, and so on. But we, as humankind, are using sand at an incredible pace. And together with sand, gravels, and crushed rocks, is altogether 50 billion tons per year we use. And this is enough to build a wall 27 meters high and 27 meters wide. My slides are traveling without me. I'll take this as a sign to move on. So by 2050, 75% of the infrastructure needed still doesn't exist. And this means that the sand required will be very, sorry, I'll have to go back. So the sand, as you see here, you have a projected population growth by 2050, and you see that the growth in different regions is very different. And in densely populated areas such as Europe and parts of the Asia Pacific, the needs will be very different than in Africa, which still has to build much of its infrastructure from scratch. I don't know, is there a way of pausing this? Pause. To build it from scratch. And let me now quickly recapitulate, because my slides are flat without me. So for low-lying areas, like island nations, Europe, those countries will think in the future about strengthening their coastlines, whereas Africa will think about building a first-class infrastructure to accommodate its new and growing population. And as we see here, we use sand for an incredible number of applications, and more the requirements on sand are driven by its end use. We use it for buildings, for infrastructure, landscape, glass making, even cosmetics. And that means that although the sun sources are diverse, they are not finite, and definitely not finite for specific applications. And although we might feel comfortable with the long list that you see here, being rock quarries, the marine environment, the riverine, sand and gravel pits, industrial co-production, recycled material, it really depends of the application and the sand needed, how big the source actually is. And definitely not every source can be used for every application. I'm often asked, yeah, but what about deserts? Well, deserts and desert sands particularly is very, well, it's quite difficult to use. I don't say it's impossible, but due to the very well sorted nature of sand, and that the grains are very well rounded and tend to be very fine, it's not really usable for many applications. You can imagine that building on such smooth ping pong balls is not going to give a very stable foundation for your house. And moreover, desert sand is often far away from where it's actually needed. What is interesting is that although most people are aware that desert sand is not very useful for applications, it is not often the knowledge about the actual compositions of the sources we do use is poorly known. Very few countries have mapped their sand resources by the actual characteristics of sand. And here you see a curve that indicates the probability of encountering a certain grain size in a river. And what you see is there is a grain size gap in rivers. So rivers with a median grain size between 1 and 5 millimeters are way less prevalent than any other river than rivers with a grain size of, let's say, 300 micrometers or more in the gravel size of things like a centimeter or so. Of course, we do not, and luckily we do not, very important to mention as well is what you see here is it's a beautiful boat. This is a dredging boat in Myanmar, and I put this slide because often in many countries when dredging works start, especially when it's just for, not for major infrastructure, but it's just about finding sand for other purposes, the sand budgets of those rivers are often not known. And the result is that on certain rivers, we have already seen quite an impact of sand extraction. And this can lead to river incision, the lowering as a consequence of the water table, a lot of turbulence and plumes that have affected the ecosystem, and so on. It could also obviously affect the resilience of cities along those rivers against floods. But as I said previously, luckily we have also the marine area where we can also take sand. But what many people do not realize is that not most, but many of our geological deposits that we judge at sea are geological deposits. They are relics from the past. They have been deposited so often many thousands years before and are not replenished at a very high rate. And also, with the sea being a dynamic environment, there are certain impacts due to dredging as well. And I've listed them here, but they largely correspond to what I mentioned for rivers. But it's clear that especially uncontrolled dredging, which is less of a problem in Europe, but uncontrolled dredging can affect our resilience against global sea level rise. It can also affect currents in the ocean, ecosystem connectivity, and so on. Here is such an example of uncontrolled sand winning on beaches. And this is not always sand mafia. This can be poor people trying to make a livelihood, taking the sand where it's closest. But it is clear that this can have huge effects on beaches and on the economy of certain coastal cities. If we see sand winning on land, and here you see a very well developed quarry, a sand pit, then it's clear that environmental and social impact assessments need to be made. And I think there are many good examples in Europe where this actually has been done. But I think to everyone, if you see a sign like that, you automatically say, yes, an environmental impact assessment is needed. But this is because it is above the water. The same is always necessary, also below the water. And let's now turn to UN Environment itself. So since UN Environment has been working on the topic of sand since 2009, where my director was witness to a beach disappearing almost overnight in Jamaica. But our first publication was in 2014, where we raised awareness about the fact that we are extracting overall about 50 billion tons of sand a year, whilst on a yearly basis, 25 billion tons are brought to the sea by the combined action of glaciers and rivers. This report was followed in 2019 by our report on sand and sustainability, finding new solutions for environmental governance of global resources, which was picked up at the UN Environmental Assembly in that very same year. And the UN Environmental Assembly is the place where all countries come together on a 2-yearly basis to assess the environment and to make decisions accordingly. And this report gave rise to the resolution on mineral extraction. And this resolution encourages basically countries to take notice of sustainable and to take notice of the importance of sustainable sand extraction. But it's not only this resolution. There is also another resolution which is very important, and that is the one of sustainable infrastructure, which encourages countries to minimize adverse impact and minimize the use of their resources. And it's in response to these two resolutions that UNEP did Geneva started a program, a research program called the Global Sand Observatory Initiative. And this to promote sustainable practices concerning sand extraction and uses, promote innovation in monitoring activities, as well as dialogue on sand governance. Our activities are, to me, the most important activity of our program is to create a platform for all stakeholders to come together and to exchange information and knowledge on sand extraction and use. Our activities are, however, not limited to that. We also work on monitoring data on extraction and use, where we ask questions such as how much, where, and what kind of sand is available in use. Is a question that is still not fully answered. How much is replenished and needed for a healthy ecosystem, and you can go so on. And our third activity is on environmental governance, where we review and analyze the existing policies, identify policy gaps on the multilateral level, try to identify good examples of policies and practices, and identify stakeholders. But I would like to attract your attention to the word local. Sand is a material that is often extracted and used locally. The percentage of sand that is traded around the world is rather small compared to other commodities like iron, like gold, which tend to be extracted and exported. Moreover, as I indicated before, the needs will be very regionalized. This means that also for governance, there will not be a one-size-fits-all approach, but there is an absolute need, a need for a global effort to come together and to exchange those best practices. And UNEP is there to help facilitate this common effort, to help exchange and collect the data needed, to provide it to the nation states for good policy making in the future. So I thank you for letting me give this presentation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion after. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Arnaud, for a really interesting presentation, giving an important global perspective of the subject. And also for those who would be interested in reading up a little bit more about the topics that Arnaud's mentioned, I can certainly recommend a book called The World in a Grain by Vince Beiser, who give a very informative book about the global use of sand. So over now to the next presenter. And the next presenter is Andrew Bellamy, who is Resources Manager, Marine Aggregates at Tarmac. He's Marine Resource Manager for Tarmac Marine Limited, 28 years of experience in the UK marine aggregate dredging industry, Fellow of the Geological Society of London, and a Chartered Geologist. So we can see your slides. Andrew, over to you.
Okay, hope you can hear me. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm going to be talking about extraction and licensing of marine sand and gravel off the United Kingdom, with some illustrated examples of how this is all done by the companies in the industry, of which Tarmac Marine is one. First of all, I'll just give you some context about the scale of the industry in the UK. Some 20 million tonnes a year of sand and gravel is dredged from the UK seabed off England and Wales, and this is used in all forms of construction in the UK and the northwestern Europe, and also for sea defences and beach replenishment. In the UK, or in Great Britain rather, marine sources account for about 11 or 12% of primary aggregate production. The rest comes from crushed rock and from natural sand and gravel quarries. There's also in Great Britain over 70 million tonnes of secondary and recycled aggregate produced. So when we include this in the total, marine sand and gravel accounts for about 7% of British demand for aggregates. But on a regional basis, if we take, for example, London and the southeast of England, marine supplies actually account for between, say, 30 and 50% of construction aggregate needs. So there are very major sort of regional contrasts across Great Britain in terms of how much is used from marine sources. So if I move on to the next slide, I can get that the icons appear. Here we are. There we are. So in terms of license areas now, this is a chart that shows the location of all the licenses off the UK. They're located between about 5 and 50 kilometres offshore, in water depths of between about 7 and 45 metres, therefore thereabouts. They're on the inner continental shelf, and there's about sort of 40 or 45 different areas licensed to a number of companies, and the seabed and the minerals on it are owned by the Crown Estate in Great Britain, and the companies in the industry have to tender to the Crown Estate as the mineral owner for rights to these areas of seabed. The companies themselves would choose which areas to bid for. So it's down to the companies in the industry to prospect for the sands and gravels and locate what they think might be a viable resource. And then when the opportunity comes along, to tender to the Crown Estate for, if you like, exclusive tenure for areas of seabed. But we can only actually dredge the seabed if we then get a marine license, which comes from the UK government. It might be Natural Resources Wales if the area was in Welsh waters, or it would be from the Marine Management Organisation, which is an agency of the British government, if it was in English waters. And those licenses have conditions attached, which the companies then have to sort of comply with. These are all statutory marine licenses. Now, to get a marine license, we would need to carry out all sorts of environmental impact assessment studies, which the companies would have to commission, and there'd be a lot of consultation involved in that. It takes several years to get a permission in the UK. But over the years, really over the past sort of 20 years or so, the industry and the government agencies involved as well have really developed a very sound understanding of the effects of dredging on the marine environment, and also how those impacts can be minimized or eliminated and managed, if you like, mitigated or reduced. So there's a large body of information that's arisen from lots of research projects that were commissioned both by government sponsorship but also by industry sponsorship as well, and that allows licenses essentially to be decided using good information, so that when permits are granted, then the information that permission is based on is of a very high standard, so that the effects on the environment are well understood and are deemed to be acceptable, of course. We also have, when a license is granted, we have a monitoring regime that kicks in straight away, and companies are responsible for commissioning surveys of the dredged areas and reporting those results. We do a lot of work collaboratively with other companies in the industry. So Tarmac is a major player within these sort of regional associations, but our counterparts in other companies in the industry work on this as well. So we have regional environmental monitoring that goes on, and also a sort of reporting and government review regime that's in place as part of the compliance with all of the licenses. So if there were any unforeseen or unacceptable impacts on the environment from the dredging, they would be detected, and the license could be modified or restricted in some way, or in extreme cases could be revoked and stopped. Okay, and then just in terms of the Crown Estate, again, we have to have a legally binding production agreement with the Crown Estate, and that's a separate document from the marine license, and that would give a company up to 30 years tenure of an area with various commercial terms attached. The companies, we pay a royalty to the Crown Estate for every tonne that we dredge, and most of that money ultimately finds its way into the UK government treasury. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, there we go, there we are. Okay, so a little bit of a word about the ships that operate in UK waters. There's about a fleet of around about 25 purpose-built aggregate dredgers that operate off the UK. These are owned mostly by the companies that have the license areas, not exclusively, but mostly. In fact, several operators run and own ships. They have license areas and they have wharves where the material is landed, and they also have downstream building materials businesses. So that there's actually a fair degree of vertical integration within the industry in the UK. And that, I think, is an important part of the buy-in that companies have to the extraction of the minerals and all the way through to the end uses of the minerals in the marketplace. And that, I think, increases the sort of attention that we pay to the environmental performance of the companies, both at sea and on land as well. So the picture you're seeing here is a brand new dredger which the company Cemex has recently built, called the Go Innovation. This is one of the most recent aggregate dredging ships to be built. In fact, it's still undergoing sea trials at the moment, but is expected to be operating fully early in the new year, I think. And a ship like this will have a life of probably 30 to perhaps 40 years. They're very well looked after, and as you might imagine, they get an awful lot of wear and tear with seawater and sand and gravel. So companies including Cemex and Tarmac as well, we take good care of the ships and hope that they would work for at least 30 years. Okay, if we go to the next slide, there we are. So a little bit about the dredging operations now. This is a photograph that I took from one of our ships. This is a dredger called the City of Chichester, working just off the Isle of Wight. So all of the dredging operations off the UK take place in carefully defined loading locations inside the licensed areas. So all the ships have accurate navigation systems and coordinates of the dredging locations within those licenses. So in this example, as I say, the City of Chichester is dredging about 12 kilometres to the southeast of the Isle of Wight, that you can see just in the background there. I just turn on the pointer. There we are. So there's the Isle of Wight, and this ship is about 12 kilometres to the southeast, dredging in about 20 metres of water. So if I move to the next slide, yeah, I mentioned the loading locations. So this is a chart of licenses in the Eastern English Channel. This is Beachy Head up here. So these are sites roughly halfway between the UK and the French coast. And you'll see the blue areas here are what we call active dredge zones, which the companies have defined. And it's normally a license condition that the company, when it gets a permit or a license, has to then limit the area dredged in some way. And we define active dredge zones within the licenses. For example, this site here, this black outline here, this license covers about 26 square kilometres, but at any one time we're only allowed to dredge in about 4 square kilometres of that area. And that's a deliberate effort to minimise the environmental footprint of the extraction, minimise the effect on the marine life and the sediments and so on. And some of these zones would stay in place for 10 years or more. We've been dredging in this locality, for example, for the past 14 years and expect to be still dredging here in another 10 years' time. So locally, there are quite thick deposits, and that allows, the understanding of that allows the dredge footprint to be minimised using these active dredge zones. Okay, if we go to the next slide. Here you can see, back on the city of Chichester again, this is what it looks like when it's dredging. You can see that the sediment is mixed with seawater. It comes down a ramp here or a chute and then drops into the cargo hold. The heavy sediment sinks to the bottom of the cargo hold and the seawater is gradually displaced over the side of the vessel through spillways. And then at the end of the cargo, the rest of the seawater would be drained out using pumps. Now loading takes between 1 and 6 hours, depending on the size of the dredger and the nature of the deposits and so on. Now a dredger like this particular ship has got a capacity of just over 2,000 tons of sand and gravel. And in the UK fleet, ships have capacities ranging from about 1,400 to nearly 12,000 tons. So a fair range of capacities there. And obviously the size of the vessel is important. If it's too big, it can't get into all of the wharves. If it's too small, it wouldn't necessarily be commercially viable. So when companies design and commission ships, they're thinking very carefully about the capacity and also the dredge depth capability of the vessel so that it fulfills its purpose for the business. And if I go to the next slide, here we are. So this is what it looks like at the end of the load. This is taken from the dredger of the City of London. Here the ship's just completing loading operations in the English Channel. And you'll see here, this is the dredge pipe, which is being raised back to the main deck where it's stowed along here when it's not in use. And you can see here that the cargo hold is full of sand and gravel, and there's still water left on the top, and that will drain through the spillways and also be pumped out while the vessel steams to its port of landing, as I explain here. When the vessel gets to the wharf, and this particular ship was heading back to a wharf at Greenwich on the River Thames, when it gets back to the wharf in about, say, 12 hours time, it would then use these buckets here to discharge the cargo. So the cargo by that time would be drained of water and will be relatively dry sand and gravel, and that can then be discharged dry by the ship itself onto a ship-to-shore conveyor belt to the wharf, where it can then be processed and used. So it's a relatively quick process. Go to the next slide. So in terms of how we find the aggregate deposits, this is an exercise in reconstructing the geology of the continental shelf. Arnaud mentioned that there are geological deposits at sea, and I think by that he meant that these are sort of fossil or relic sediments. That's exactly what we're dredging off the UK. Most of the aggregate deposits were formed in ancient river floodplains during the Ice Age, when the sea levels were much lower. They're also formed next to glaciers and ice sheets that spread out into the North Sea. And also there are sand dunes and sand waves, sandbanks and so on that exist, which formed when the sea rose after the Ice Age. But these are all relict deposits that were laid down thousands of years ago. They're not being replaced at the present time. They are finite resources, but nevertheless, in certain localities, there are large volumes of them still remaining. And to detect these deposits offshore, the industry relies on a combination of shallow seismic profile data. This is an example of that here. And also we collect borehole or core samples from the seabed at various locations that we choose from the interpretation of records like this. So just to give you a very brief explanation of this, these are profiles through the seabed. It's rather like cutting a cake. You can suddenly see various structures beneath the seabed when you open the cake out, if you follow me. So here you can see different sort of seismic signatures, as we call them, where there are different kind of textures and patterns within the data, and that all denotes different environments of deposition of these sediments, and also can be used to interpret the grain size of the sediment as well. So without going into too much detail at this moment, you can see that I've labelled these as fine sands, this area here, and then this area over here as gravels. And that, in essence, this is the sort of data that we would use to reconstruct the thickness and the extent and the geometry of these ancient deposits. And we collect data like this on survey line spacings of typically less than 250 meters across the site. So we get quite detailed data that we can use to reconstruct in quite a lot of fine detail, you know, the extent of these sediments and resources. And of course, we can also pick up in this information areas that we don't want to dredge, which might be rock outcrops where there might be reefs and so on, or it could be areas of clay where obviously we want to avoid those because that would spoil the aggregate cargo. So this information is very useful to us for that purpose as well. I move on. This is a picture at sunrise in the English Channel showing one of these coring machines. It's called a vibrocorer. This is what we would use to take samples from the seabed. They might be 3 meters long, like in this example here. You can just see a crew member's arm there for scale, but we can also use 6 meter long vibrocorers as well to get information on the sediments at depth within these various areas. But this sort of operation is relatively expensive, so we would choose a few locations based on the interpretation of the seismic data first. And taken together, all those pieces of information are extremely helpful in deciding where the most appropriate or the best aggregate deposits would lie. So if I try and move to the next slide, I can see there we go. So yeah, this is a chart that we would draw from that information. So you don't need to see the detail here, but if you can, the colours on the chart denote the extent of the resource. So the yellows and the browns are the extent of the resource, and the blue colours are where there is the underlying bedrock or older strata, might be chalk or Cretaceous green sand, whatever. That's where the bedrock at seabed occurs, where we wouldn't want to dredge. Now, for scale, these grid squares are 500 meters in size, and this site is just southwest of the Isle of Wight here. So essentially, the geologist would look at all of the seismic data and the sample data, and then produce a chart of the thicknesses of the mineral resources and map out their extent using various computer graphics techniques, as well as a degree of interpretation himself or herself, and produce a chart like this. And this would form the basis for our resource assessment and the decision as to whether we would actually apply for a license for a site such as this. Right, so I'll go to the next one. So once we've, just skipping a few steps now, but once we've got the license, we would then devise a dredge plan for our ships. And this is an example of how we might go about that. So this is a license area off Hastings here. There's the scale, 1,000 meters. You'll see that the gravel deposit is picked out in the orange and sandier deposits in the paler yellow color here. We're looking for gravels in this particular case. So what we've done is, taking the natural geometry of the deposit, we've tried to then consider factors such as the water depth and the tidal current direction. And when we do that, we then put in dredge lanes over the top of the resource, which are orientated in such a way as to assist the dredgers when they're working, because we generally dredge parallel to the tidal currents. So these particular dredge lanes might be, say, 200 meters wide and perhaps 1 to 2 kilometers long, which is a typical loading area size for a dredger of anything from a sort of 2,000 to a 10,000 ton capacity ship would need an area of that extent to load in a sensible amount of time, a viable amount of time for the cargo program. So this information, which we draw up in the office, of course, then has to be passed to the ship in a form that they can use. We don't give the ships too much unnecessary geological detail, but we do give them the precise coordinates of where they need to load. So this next chart gives you an example of what that might look like on the ship. They would have the license boundary shown in red, which they must not cross when they're loading. And then in green, they would have the loading lanes picked out here. We give them names so that it just assists in identification. And we might also put exclusion zones, dredge exclusion zones on these charts, like these grey areas here. There are two shown here. One is for a shipwreck, which clearly we want to avoid, so we put an exclusion zone around that. And another one, this long thin area, is where the resource is getting quite thin and we want to avoid too much extraction at that locality. Otherwise, we might break through into the underlying clay bedrock, which we want to avoid. So there's an exclusion zone put in for that as well. And how we define that is using the monitoring data that we collect, and I'll show you that shortly. But when the ship is dredging, it records its track plot as it's going. This is the blue line here, and it would come up avoiding the exclusion zone there. You can see turning and would finish its load just as it's about to leave the license area there. So in essence, that's how the geological information is translated into information that the ship can then use on a regular basis to dredge the cargo in exactly the right location. And of course, we would come back to this exact location when the next cargo was required, so we get a good consistency of cargo material as well. And then all of this dredging activity, which is taking place 24 hours a day, every day of the year in the industry, all of it is monitored by essentially a black box recorder, or it's an electronic monitoring system. This is a photograph of the latest version of this system. It's actually been in use since 1993 on UK aggregate dredgers. That they're not allowed to work on Crown Estate licenses without this system being approved and in use. But it's also been upgraded, as you might imagine. Technology's moved on over the years. So most recently it was upgraded in 2018 and is completely tamper-proof. The unit is officially owned by the Crown Estate and sits on board. It's the responsibility of the company and the crew to ensure that it's looked after, of course, but and to make sure that the dredge sensors are working. But the data it produces is encoded and gets transmitted to the Crown Estate's offices in real time, really. And then officials can then check the status of the dredger, what it was doing, where it was, whether it was dredging or just steaming. All of that information is recorded. So if there was any out of area dredging, that would be detected very, very quickly, and the company would have to explain what had happened. And the system works on vibration sensors that are placed on the dredge pipe. So when the ship is pumping water, the system would know it was water. And if then sediment starts to come through the pipe, whether it's gravel and sand that causes vibration of a different frequency, that would be picked up by the sensor as well. And then the system would record the ship as dredging. Right, and then this information has actually been used not only for regulatory purposes, but also to build up a kind of a picture of the footprint of aggregate dredging off the UK on an annual basis, so that the industry working with the Crown Estate can produce a report every year of the area dredged. So we know how many square kilometres of seabed are dredged in any one year, what the trends are over time, and also we can use the information to help discuss and investigate the environmental effects of dredging through one variable, which of course is the extent of the dredging activity itself. So it's been very helpful from an environmental point of view, as well as from a regulatory point of view. Okay, so just going to go back now to the stage when we have to actually try and obtain the license. So I mentioned earlier on about environmental impact assessments. All the companies have to commission these when they want to apply for a new license area to dredge. And in recent years, we've been carrying out regional environmental assessments as a prelude to site-specific license applications. So this is a photograph on my desk at the office showing just some examples of recent regional environmental assessments that have been carried out. This one's for the Humber region. and we've done studies for other regions like the South Coast and the Outer Thames Estuary and off East Anglia and so on. All of the information in here includes studies into the cumulative and in combination effects of aggregate dredging on the environment, based on existing licensed dredging, but also on projections of future dredging activity based on the license applications that companies are making. So these regional studies form a very solid basis for the next stage, which is the site-specific environmental assessments. And here's another example on my desk of various site-specific studies that have been carried out for individual license areas. Every individual license area would need a coastal impact study to look, for example, at the effects of offshore dredging on coastal processes, you know, whether it might cause coast erosion or changes to sedimentation. That's studied very carefully. And then we'd look at factors such as the effects of dredging on fisheries and on marine life and maritime archaeology, for example. So all these topics are covered both at a regional scale, but also at a site-specific scale in all of these assessments. Now, all of these studies would be then completed and then passed to the Marine Management Organisation or Natural Resources Wales, and they would consult on the projects and the studies with their advisors and other stakeholders, whether it's Natural England or Historic England or local authorities and so on, to get views on the project that's proposed and also on the results of the environmental assessment studies as well. So that process would take several years in total. So from sort of prospecting an area to getting a permit might potentially take between 5 and 10 years, depending on the site in question. In more recent years, things have partly speeded up due to the environmental information that we now have at our fingertips, but also there's still a very high kind of administrative and consultation burden that's placed. So it can still take several years to get a new permission. So companies need to sort of plan ahead when they're planning their new license areas. And then just moving on to monitoring now, if we look at this chart here, this is an example of regional environmental monitoring that we're doing. All the aggregate producing regions off the UK are subject to a programme of seabed sampling and geophysical surveys every 2 or 3 years during the licence term. And this is a chart from the Humber region, and the dots are sample sites that we have to take within all of the licence areas off the Humber. Can't really see them, but the clusters of dots here correspond to both the licence area and a buffer zone around it, sort of a secondary impact zone, if you like, around the licence area. The red are where we get samples for particle size only, and then the green, which are more distant from the dredging, are for a combination of particle size and macro benthic data as well, which would involve some laboratory work and so on with the sediment samples when they're returned to the laboratories. And the rationale for this, if I just move on to the next bullet point, this is actually a government designed sort of monitoring programme. The array for these samples is provided by the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, which are the UK's advisors on fisheries for the government. That's CFAS. It's quite a large scale initiative. There are hundreds of sample sites per aggregate producing region, but there are in fact savings for the industry in terms of cost and for everyone involved in terms of the time and effort of monitoring the activity of the industry in total. So yeah, the rationale really in brief is that the particle size of the sample sediments is compared to the pre-dredge particle size using various statistical tests, and any significant changes in those sediments are detected and then displayed on analytical charts on a sample by sample basis. And if there's any major changes in the sediment, that would flag something up, and there'll be further investigations done to see whether the dredging could be causing effects that might have a longer term effect on the marine life. So far, fortunately, almost all the results have been very reassuring, but nevertheless, the system is extremely rigorous, to pick up any changes that might occur over time. In addition to this sample work, we do also carry out geophysical surveys where we compare the seabed level changes caused by the dredging activity. Because these deposits are relics or fossil, when we dredge the seabed and remove the mineral, we're deepening the water. And invariably, those dredged areas don't fill back in again. So we can see the effects of the dredging on the seabed very, very clearly. So if I now show you a chart like this, this is a multi-beam bathymetric chart from an area in the Eastern English Channel. The smooth red seabed that you can see here is the sort of pre-dredge seabed. And where dredging's taken place, you can see the sort of lines left by the drag head of the ship. And then where there's been more dredging, it coalesces into these shallow depressions here, which on the scale, the red is about 33 meters and the blue goes down to just over 40. So you get an impression there of the depth of extraction that's been taking place in this area, which is relatively small. That's 500 meters on the scale there. So this is the kind of high resolution, full coverage multi-beam data that we would collect from all of our dredging areas on a regular basis during the license term. And then that information can be analysed by comparing one survey to another. This is a chart from a site just off the Isle of Wight that's heavily dredged. And then the colours on here denote the amount of seabed lowering caused between the two surveys by the dredging activity. So this might be comparing, for example, data in 2012 with data in 2019. And where it's grey, there's been virtually no change at all, probably because there's been no dredging there. But where there's green and yellow on this chart, we can see some seabed lowering. And from this information, we can then monitor the remaining thickness of the resource. And if there are limits on the resource extraction in the license, then we can help to comply with those conditions using information like this. Okay, just a little bit about sort of monitoring in conservation zones. We have one or two dredging licenses that are close to important conservation areas offshore. They might be fish spawning grounds or rocky reef environments where there's a very high level of marine diversity. And we'd never be allowed to dredge, on those places, of course, but we do sometimes dredge close by, which might imply that there could be effects from the sand that the dredger puts back in the water. So when we're carrying out the dredging during the year, we would carry out surveys. This is an example of one such survey where we get a combination of very high resolution bathymetric data over spawning grounds. You can just see sort of black marks on this record here of a small patch of seabed. These marks are only about 1 or 2 meters across. That's where fish are spawning. And this is a photograph of one of those sort of nests, as we call them. It's a species of fish called black sea bream that clears sediment using its fins and so on. And it lays eggs on the exposed bedrock in this one locality. Obviously, any dredging too close to here could cause problems, potentially. So we have to monitor to make sure that the predictions of our environmental impact assessment are correct. And so far, all the results from this work that's now been going on for several years have been very reassuring. But as a side benefit, we're getting an awful lot of data that the conservation authorities in Sussex can use to help manage the conservation zone and look at its sort of status, its environmental status. So again, as well as giving reassuring results about the dredging activity, this data is also helping sort of local conservation initiatives and management of fishing activity as well. So getting near the end now, this is an example of a spreadsheet. This really, we have an awful lot of licenses and an awful lot of conditions attached to those licenses. And it's very important that we don't forget to do anything. So we have a system in place using Google Smartsheets in this example, which lists out all of the various things we have to do, all the surveys, the reports, and so on that we have to do, all the approvals we need to get. And then we have dates that they're required to be done by. And then we also record when the survey is completed. And then we have various sort of diary dates here, like when the report's been submitted to the regulator, when the regulator has signed it off, say they're happy with it. And then we have links as well. If you click on these dates, you would then be taken straight to the letter in question or to the report itself. And then we have a kind of a Gantt chart approach here where we map out the workload that's coming in all the years of the license, going through from year 1 to year 15, so that we can sort of properly manage the workload to make sure we fully comply with the license conditions. And this is a sort of system that we use in Tarmac, but I know the other companies in the industry use very similar approaches as well. We do share quite a few dredging areas with our counterparts in the industry. and we cooperate on license compliance like this as well. So by working together, we're also able to ensure that we comply with the statutory conditions that the government sets for the extraction. And then finally, I want to say a word about our trade association. A lot of the work I've described here, things like regional monitoring and regional environmental assessment, has been, if you like, promoted and facilitated through an effective industry body. So the UK sand and gravel industry comes under the umbrella of the British Marine Aggregate Producers Association, easier if you say BMAPA, and that's part of the UK Mineral Products Association. And this is a slide showing various publications that the association has produced, either on its own with the companies helping out, or in cooperation with, say, the Crown Estate or scientists and other government bodies. So we have things like an archaeological reporting protocol, good practice guidance that new entrants to the industry can use to understand how things should be done well, an area dredged report, looking at the dredging areas themselves, and then even pamphlets about dredging and its impacts on the seabed and the geological history of the dredging areas themselves and how that relates to coastal processes, things that we've done for local authorities. So a whole raft of publications that over the past, again, sort of 25 years or so have come from an effective industry body that plays a big part in the sort of success of our industry at the moment. And that is the last slide. So thank you for listening, if you're still there, and I hope you found that useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for an excellent presentation that gives a good example of how marine sand and dredging is actually undertaken in a regulated environment and how environmental safeguards are taken into consideration and monitoring. So we have just under half an hour for questions now. I'll start with the questions that have already come in and would encourage you to send some more questions in if you wish. And then later on, I'll introduce the panel, the wider panel we have from EMSAGG committee members. But to start with, first of all, a question for Arnaud. If you can unmute yourself and confirm you can hear me.
I do hear you, yeah.
Great. The question is from Mark Roche. And the question is, the Sustainable Development Triangle includes 3 poles: economy, social equity, and environment. How does the UN Environment Programme encourage collaboration with the economic actors?
So everyone hears me because I
yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So when it comes to economic actors, the reality at the moment is actually that most information is coming from the economic actors. So in the way that we encourage is actually we are asking the economical actors in developed nations is actually to provide information and to make information available on how they extract material. That is one thing. So there is the information sharing aspect. Another one is indeed, and I think that is also quite relevant, is sharing of the information of where they actually dredge and how much they actually dredge. At the moment, of course, for extraction companies like the one Andrew indicated, they are clearly keeping track on how much sand they are dredging. But for many big infrastructure works, there is not such thing as a sand footprint. So we actually encourage all actors to extract sand, gravel, to keep track on how much material they are actually tracking, and where possible, indeed, to cooperate with their countries and to share the information with them, because also that the last one is absolutely not a given in many countries. Often soil investigations are done, but the results of those soil investigations are not necessarily disclosed with the nation states. I think these are activities that actually the UN highly encourages. Is this sharing of information, this the innovation aspects of things, is to think about innovations, to think about reducing your environmental impact, to share the results both in when the results were negative and positive. So it's not about just sharing the wins, but also if you tested something and it was absolutely a negative result, please share that as well, because it can be a very useful piece of information for other countries. And I'm thinking, for example, on using fine material, soft soils as infill material. That has been done in Singapore by a Dutch company. This is interesting information to share. This is how alternative materials can be used in a safe way or not, as we saw quite recently with another country that used dolomite sand for reclaiming a beach, where there are big environmental concerns about the material being used. So it's really about, for companies, for the economical component, it is about sharing data, sharing information that they can really do. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you very much. There's another quite technical question from Jan-Jaap Tsimirisa, and it's a question to you again, Arnaud. It's relating to the graph you showed, and he said, how does the grain size 1 to 5 millimeters are found less often? Why is it found less often? Is this specific river behavior, and or is it just found in the samples that you use? So how representative is that graph?
So that graph comes from research. I've got the name of the researchers, but they aggregated data of over 400 rivers. And in all fairness, it also corroborates with my own findings as a geologist. I have in the past done many soil investigations for a dredging company as well. And it turns out that the transition from gravel to medium to coarse sand happens rather quickly. And it's something which is not fully understood. But it seems that larger grain sizes in that range are more easily disintegrated by the actions of the river, by the way they are transported. And those who are familiar with hydraulics and sediment transport knows that some material goes in suspense, other material hops on the river bottom, another one, and the coarsest material almost glides over the bottom. And so it seems that this 1 to 5 millimeter is easily broken down. The second thing is that, and this is my experience, that it's not in those articles, but if you want to find grain sizes between 1 and 5 millimeter, it tends to be in areas with granite rock, where the minerals themselves that make up the rock are larger than, for example, a sandstone made out of fine grades. So the core components that make up the rock, the strongest component, the mineral itself, are larger in a granite, and therefore those grains tend to be more resistant to being broken down. But it is a process that is still being researched and not fully understood. And then another interesting fact for those who are interested in the science of those, is that when you go from gravel to this finer sands in rivers, you also see a change in slope of the rivers, which has been, by some research, has been linked to
your sound is beginning to break up, Arnaud.
A causing factor or a result of this transition. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have.
If it's fine, then I'll close my camera and I might be better understood.
That's fine. We can hear you better. But thanks for answering that question. We have another question, but I think before reading this out, I'd just like to introduce a few people from the EMSAGG committee, because Cees mentioned that we meet in different parts of Europe normally when there isn't lockdown. But we would now like to open the microphones for a number of other people on the call. And before I ask the next question, and on the call we have Sigmund Schlee, who's Technical Director of Boskalis Baltic Sea region in Germany, Mark Roche from FVS Economy, Federal Public Service of Belgium, Laura Addington, Industry and Eco-Innovation Division of the Ministry of Environment and Food, Denmark, Brigitte Louvert from the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, MUM, and I believe Nick Everington of Crown Estate has recently had to leave the meeting. But your microphones should now be all open. So before I ask the initial questions to Arnaud and Andrew, I may ask you to come in afterwards. So the question really is, as Dr. Bellamy has described, the UK has a robust regulatory regime and extraction is closely monitored for environmental impact. What needs to be done to encourage less well-managed parts of the world to adopt these levels of sustainable development? So maybe if I can start with you, sort of, Andrew, for an initial view, and then going out widely.
Well, I suppose from an industry perspective in the UK, it starts with effective government regulation, really. I mean, there's been an industry extracting sand and gravel from the seabed in the UK for many decades. But in 2009, I think, we had an Act of Parliament, the Marine and Coastal Access Act, and from that date onwards, we established a statutory licensing system for marine aggregates in the UK, which obviously resulted in a degree of tightening of regulation. But even before that, during the 1980s, 1990s and noughties, we were regulated very carefully by the Department of the Environment and the Crown Estate under a non-statutory system, but it still provided a very effective level of regulation. And that's where it begins. And I think from there, you would then expect the companies in the industry to be professionally run and to be accountable to the government and follow the license conditions that are stipulated. So I think it starts with good government regulation.
Thank you. Arnaud, what are your views on that?
I think what Andrew says is very interesting, and I think what I have to say to add in addition to that is Andrew indicates what is interesting to me is actually that it's not only the environment that benefits from good regulation, it's actually also the operators that benefit from good and well-organized regulation. And let me give you an example. We see in the Southeast Asian region that where the regulation was more, where either the regulation was there but was difficult to enforce, or there was a lack of regulation in certain countries, where we had over extraction, and that companies decided actually to close the sand market, it's to say the sand market for export, where we saw countries like Vietnam who have opened and closed their market for sand exports. And this is a clear example of if good regulation and monitoring had been in place, then and control had been in place, then this market could have been stabilized, organized in a proper way. And the danger of these bands, of these boom and bust economies, as sand economies, is that when you open the sand export market and there is such a huge demand, then new companies pop up with often very little experience. They over extract where the country needs to intervene, close the market again, which kills basically those new industries before they can establish themselves properly, and puts all the pressure then on the neighboring countries. And I think nobody wins then, because the environment also doesn't win. Because if those boom and busts are incredibly damaging to the environment, where you have new players with very little knowledge over extracting certain areas, the market closes, the whole shift goes to the neighboring country for sand to be exported, and so on and so on and so on. And you get until the sand price is high enough, they open the market again, and the story starts over again. So yeah, I can only agree with Andrew that it's good regulation is of fundamental importance.
Okay, thanks. Could I ask whether any of the EMSAGG panelists want to add a view on that? And if you could introduce yourself when you first speak, please. Anyone from the panelist, or shall I move on to the next question?
May I make a comment? Marc Roche from SPF Economy, Belgium. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
My feeling is that this question goes through education and communication. How can we promote the promotion of the advantage of adopting a legislation that allows equitable and sustainable management of the sand resource by another way that a democratic mean? I think it takes a lot of resource, and I'm afraid that a lot of countries under pressure cannot do that. So please comment. I think Arnaud is on the best place to comment that.
Yeah. Okay, noted. Anyone else from the panel wish to comment at this stage? No. Okay. So then the next question is from Tanya White, and I'll try and paraphrase it because it's a long question, but I believe, Tanya, you are asking, with all the monitoring that it's been done, so it's directed to Andrew, in terms of pre and post situation, how does the monitoring actually talk about the abundance or the remaining amount of sand and or any matters relating to depletion?
Yeah, the geophysical surveys look at the seabed before we dredge, and then while we're extracting the mineral, we can monitor the rate of extraction and the amount of remaining resource. And it's essentially that's how it's done. It's a combination of the geological information that we collect at the outset, where we would assess the amount of the volume of the resource on the seabed, and then the depletion of that resource is monitored using the various monitoring surveys during the term of the license. And it's very much the onus is very much on the individual companies to manage their own resources. So government would play a role in terms of sort of strategic reconnaissance surveys of the UK continental shelf to look at broad resource areas, but it's down to individual companies to prospect smaller sites offshore to find viable mineral deposits. So each of the companies in the industry has its own, if you like, resource portfolio, which depletes over time. These are finite resources, as I say, and it's up to those companies to then decide if they want to go for new licenses in the future to replenish their own store of mineral reserves. So in the UK, certainly it's down to individual companies to like manage that, but the government does play a role at a sort of a more strategic reconnaissance level, having a broader understanding of the geology of the UK continental shelf. And the Crown Estate, I know, has been involved in that with government departments over the years, bringing in what we call the British Geological Survey, which are the government's advisors on any matters to do with earth science.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Anyone else from the panel wish to come in on that from your individual country perspectives?
Well, I would actually like to add that this is, on Andrew, this is where actually the TILES project, which was executed by Vander for the Belgian coast and part of the Dutch coast, if I understand it correctly, is an absolute exemplary project on how countries actually should take things forward. I think it's of utmost importance that as a country you do know what your sand reserves are, what your geological reserves are, how that is done. I think there are different ways. I think it's also interesting what the Dutch are doing, where companies actually need to provide their boreholes and borehole campaigns to the government, which can definitely reduce the cost of the government itself to estimate your sand reserves. But in terms of looking ahead, looking at the future, knowing that many of those countries around the North Sea have low-lying areas and that they will have to protect their coastlines, it is of fundamental importance to know how much sand and what kind of sand is off your coast, so that in 10-20 years' time, you're not faced with a very tough decision about dredging the last gravel beds that you need, or coarse sand beds that you need for your bunds in order to protect your coast, and removing a very valuable ecosystem. And I think some foresight is needed here. And I think project of Vander demonstrates a very, very valuable example of how this can be.
Yeah, if I just come in on that, that's a good point, and I agree with Arnaud on that very much. It was a very good project, and I think I should just add in the UK that the companies in the industry do have to submit their mineral reserve information, the volumes, to the Crown Estate on an annual basis, and the Crown Estate collates all that information confidentially and then produces sort of figures for marine sand and gravel resources and reserves off the UK, and that information is passed to central government and also to local government within the United Kingdom, so that planners in local authorities around the UK can then make decisions about mineral planning within their counties within the United Kingdom. So the marine input there that the Crown Estate facilitates is seen as extremely useful. So yes, while individual companies do have their own information, that information does get passed to public bodies, so that, you know, again, more strategic level judgments can be made in the UK about the levels of resource that remain.
Okay, thank you. We're coming to a close, unfortunately, but I would like to make a couple of points. The EMSAGG will be planning future webinars of this nature over the next coming year, one on marine spatial planning and one on dealing with unexploded ordnance. But while everyone is on the call, if you have any suggestions for follow-up events on this topic or anything else that EMSAGG could develop, please stick your idea into the chat box or into the question box, and we'll discuss this at the next committee. I'd like to end with a sort of a general question given Cees's introduction to the aims of EMSAGG, and given the contrasting situations described by Arnaud and Andrew in terms of world unregulated and regulated environments, what role can an organization like EMSAGG, who have representatives from the industry, from regulators, and from environmental bodies, what role might EMSAGG have in helping to move the debate forward? So maybe could I start by inviting in, if anyone from the EMSAGG panel wishes to contribute, or Cees, would you like to contribute?
Yes, of course. Yes. Now, the advantage of the EMSAGG is that geological surveys, other governmental research organizations, and dredging companies are members. So the experts of all those disciplines are coming together and convene, and the members can put questions to them, and it can be of enormous help to have this community of disciplines together.
Okay. Any other views, or Arnaud, any reflections on how an organization like EMSAGG might be able to help?
No, but I think that Cees is absolutely right. It's what he has created is absolutely valuable. There are very few organizations that bring both the regulatory, the monitoring, and the industry together, and where information exchange can happen in such a way. That's very valuable. Often the information exchange is like who are also useful, but are often by just within the industry, within one industry branch. I think there is an absolute need for regional organizations to share information, by preference cross industry, cross regulatory and industry, to share those experiences and to share this information. I think it's the way forward. And I think from a point of view from the UN, as a UN body, it's way easier to work together with organizations like EMSAGG than with all players individually.
Okay, thank you very much. Any final points from anyone else from the EMSAGG panel that's online with us today? Okay, one final reminder, if you do have suggestions for future events like this, then please put them onto the chat or send it into the CIRIA team. So I've certainly felt that this has been a very interesting and informative morning. I hope everyone on the line does as well. So to conclude, I'd just like to thank everyone who has joined us today's webinar, and in particular, of course, thanks to the speakers for sharing your insight and expertise, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.